I would like to welcome you all to today's event, which is organized in collaboration with the Cyprus High Commission in the UK. Today we have the pleasure and honor to host as our speaker a distinguished Cypriot archaeologist, Professor Demetres Michaelides, who is going to present his work on ancient medicine in Cyprus. We're also very pleased to welcome my colleague, Dr. Daniel King, who is going to offer a response to Professor Michaelides' paper. Professor Michaelides will be introduced by His Excellency Mr. Andreas Kakouris, the High Commissioner of Cyprus in the UK, whom we warmly
recording in progress
to join us today. Mr. Kakouris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Gerolemu. Dear friends in the UK, Cyprus and further afield. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's online public lecture by Professor Demetres Michaelides, focusing on archaeological evidence of medical practice in ancient Cyprus. Not your normal run-of-the-mill subject, which makes it even more intriguing, particularly today, when we're all grappling individually and as an international community with the COVID pandemic which has enveloped the globe. I would like to thank and welcome Demetres Michaelides, Professor Emeritus at the University of Cyprus and a distinguished figure in the field of archaeology with worldwide recognition. His experience, achievements and engagement in the field of archaeology are expansive, both from the practical as well as the academic and research angles. His biography is indeed substantial and substantive, and for fear of taking away time from the lecture itself, I would merely highlight a sprinkling of his achievements. Professor Michaelides was appointed archaeological officer for the district of Paphos at the Cyprus Department of Antiquities in 1982. He joined the University of Cyprus in 1992 and was the first head of the Department of History and Archaeology from 1996 to 2000, and director of the Archaeological Research Unit from 1996 to 2014. He has directed excavations in Libya, Italy, and of course Cyprus, and has published widely and presented numerous papers and lectures around the world. He is the Vice President of the Association Internationale pour l'étude de la Mosaïque Antique, President Emeritus of the International Committee for the Conservation of Mosaics, and National Delegate for Cyprus to the International Society for the History of Medicine. He is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, as well as on the board of several national and international foundations and societies. In 2015, he was honored by the Italian president with the title of Grande Ufficiale della Stella d'Italia. And since 2019, he is one of the 12 elected founding members of the Cypriot Academy of Sciences, Letters, and Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, being at the crossroads of the ancient world and the lighthouse in the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus showcases a particularly active ancient medical community, deploying advanced practices and medicaments. I must admit that I was fascinated with the subject matter, and when I was asked to offer some opening remarks, I embarked on what can only be described as some form of amateur research of my own. More often than not, the name Demetres Michaelides popped up when reading articles or abstracts. I do not intend in any way to encroach on what the professor will tell us, but I was fascinated by how far back recognition of Cyprus's vegetation and minerals in preparing medicaments is recorded, as well as the travels to Cyprus, specifically for the medicinal substances available of renowned scientists of that time, Dioscorides and Galen of Pergamon. It must be said that Cyprus was not without its own glowing examples of respected doctors, with Apollonian of Kition and Zenon the Cypriot. And I believe I speak for all in saying that we look forward with much anticipation to Professor Michaelides' presentation and the discussions to follow. Allow me also to say that the Cyprus High Commission and I personally as High Commissioner are delighted to have partnered with the University of Exeter and specifically the Department of Classics and Ancient History for today's event. the department hosts a wide range of research projects, events, workshops, and seminars, many of which are dedicated to the study and promotion of ancient Cypriot and Greek culture. Please allow me to single out, if I may, Dr. Daniel King and Dr. Maria Gerolemu for their most valuable contribution to the study of various aspects of ancient Cypriot and Greek culture through conferences, publications, and of course, teaching. Today's lecture is part of the online seminar series, Ancient Medicine and Technology, organized by Maria Gerolemu and George Gazantzidis from the University of Patras. In ending, I would like to pay special thanks to Dr. Gerolemu and my own cultural counselor here at the High Commission, Dr. Marios Psaras, for bringing this wonderful initiative to fruition. I very much hope that today's event marks the beginning of a close and growing cooperation between the High Commission of Cyprus and the University of Exeter. I end with the sincere hope that a future event with the University of Exeter can take place in person. With these few words, I extend again my heartfelt wishes to all for what I am certain will be a fascinating and illuminating lecture. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your generous and kind introduction. I will disappoint you that I will not say much about the doctors of Cyprus, but I hope you find the rest interesting. I would also like to thank, obviously, the organizers of these seminars that have been of particular interest to me, Yoros Gazantzidis and especially Maria Gerolemu, who first got in touch with me, and of course, Daniel King, who undertook to be the respondent to my talk. So, you can all see my screen now? Yeah, okay. Cyprus cannot boast the fame of Kos or Epidaurus as a center of medical knowledge in the ancient world. Until a few decades ago, the island's relation to medicine centered almost entirely on the many references to its plants and minerals used for the preparation of medicaments, as well as to the 1st century Apollonius of Kition and his famous Periarthron on joints, one of the oldest commentaries on the work of Hippocrates and a very early illustrated medical textbook surviving in an 8th century copy. Apollonius is one of about 20 eponymous doctors so far known as practicing on Cyprus. I will not discuss them since the evidence comes from the literary and epigraphic sources. I will, however, make one exception for Onassis mentioned on the tablet of Idalion. This was written in the early 5th century BC in the Cypriot syllabary, which, for those that might not know, was the way Greek was written on the island before the Greek alphabet was introduced. This is an accord made between, on one side, the king of Idalion, Stasikypros, and the Demos, and on the other, by Onassis, son of an Onasikypros, during the siege of their city by the Persians. According to this, Onassis, who is referred to as Iatir and presumably a professional doctor, assisted by his brothers, undertook to take care of those wounded during the siege without receiving a fee from the wounded themselves. Instead, the doctors would receive silver or land, as well as several privileges, all of which would pass to their descendants. In terms of the medical profession, which in this case appears to have been a family business, this is of the utmost importance given the date, as this is a professional contract drawn up by the state in order to guarantee the correct and speedy treatment of the citizens during the siege. Of course, the tablet is full of myriad other important bits of information, but there's no time to discuss them. Ex votos provide precious information, albeit indirectly, related to medical practice and the maladies that afflicted the ancient Cypriots. The ex votos are divided into two groups. The first consists of terracotta and, less frequently, stone figurines representing scenes of childbirth. They include interesting details, such as the midwife assisting the travailing woman, who is often, but not always, supported from behind by another female figure. The parturient is depicted seated, which was the normal position in antiquity, and she's seated either on a stool or on the knees of the assistant. However, there are also figurines where the parturient is represented standing. These statuettes date mostly to the Archaic period, becoming less frequent by the later Hellenistic and Roman times, when a new type of ex voto was introduced. The ex votos are now made of limestone and sculpted either in the round or in high relief, with representations of the organs or the parts of the human body for the healing of which the help of the god was entreated. Many, but not all, are provided with holes for hanging. In a much less frequent variety, the details are painted on a flat tile. Some of the most common types are female breasts, male genitals, ears, eyes, single, double, or even triple. And of course, these reflect the problems that the ancient Cypriots were facing. They are representative of the maladies they suffered from. Some of these ex votos seem to be offerings thanking a deity for the cure of a certain ailment. I believe, however, that many of them were dedicated by the sick persons or members of their family with the wish that the deity would cure a trauma, an illness, or an infirmity. And very rarely, there is an inscription or extra detail applied in paint, making the nature of the ailment more explicit. The lobes of these ears, for example, bear syllabic inscriptions. One is difficult to understand. The other has been read as, "I belong to a deaf person," leaving no doubt as to what the problem is. The swollen lips of this face, no doubt, are indicative of the condition, as are the male genitals with a very swollen pubic area and the red dot. In this case, the dilated pupil of the left eye of the face must be indicative of the dedicant's complaint. It has been suggested to me that this is a case of the Holmes-Addis syndrome or an Argyll-Robertson pupil, but I am not a doctor and I cannot judge, but certainly they are trying to show something here. In some cases, inscriptions inform us of the deity to which a given ex voto was dedicated. One mentions Serapis, Isis, and Anubis, but most are dedicated to Theos Ipsistos, the highest of gods, which is of difficult interpretation. And of course, we can be sure that there were dedications to other gods too. It is interesting to note that both post and pre-cure ex votos, very similar to the ancient ones, but made of beeswax, are still common in Cyprus. And do note that on the eye, lower left, the addition of a black-eyed bean for extra detail or realism. Such ex votos are dedicated to a given saint in prayer for the cure of that particular part of the body, and they are either hung around or placed near the icon of the saint. But there is also another type of water which is dedicated after the cure. This is more evident in cases where we have ex-votos of whole babies or even of grown-ups, and above all, of gigantic candles. These are the result of a vow that if an ailing person is cured, the full weight of his or her body will be given to the church or dedicated in wax, beeswax. We will now examine some finds which are more directly related to medicine and doctors. As I mentioned, Cyprus was renowned as a source of plants and minerals for the preparation of medicaments. The evidence is primarily literary, excuse me, this is me, is primarily literary, so I will not go into it. Suffice it to say that Dioscorides makes 5 references to plants on Cyprus and mentions at least 24 Cypriot pharmaceutical substances, mineral and vegetal. Also, in 166 AD, Galen traveled to Cyprus personally in order to collect minerals from the island's mines that he took back with him to Rome to use in his practice. At the same time, Galen collected information on a number of pharmaceutical plants of the region. Also important in this respect is a fragment of Aristotle's Physics, according to which, quote, "It was found on the island of Cyprus that there was a mountain larger and higher than all others, which was called Troodos," the name it preserves today, of course. I continue with the quote. Troodos, where there were many different kinds of plants useful for the art of medicine. And if I attempt to talk about each one individually, time will not be sufficient to tell everything. Further on, he adds, Troodos has various mines of gold and silver and copper and stypteria, excuse me, that shouldn't have happened, and stypteria, split and white, and true stypteria, and sori, and yeast of gold, and misi, and halkitis, and other metals, end of quote. And we know that all these strange sounding minerals were also used in medicine. We know it from other authors, of course. The archaeological evidence for the medicaments is rare, but it does exist. Of prime importance is this pottery sherd from the Polish excavations of the Villa of Theseus in Paphos, where, as you can see, there is an inscription in ink, Hypochistidos Hilos. This is either a sherd used as a label or a fragment of a pot containing Hypochistidos Hilon, a well-known tonic and astringent. It was prepared from Chitinus hypocystis, a parasite growing on the root of the cistus, hence its name, hypocystis. The juice of hypocystis in wine or mixed with other medicaments had a multitude of uses, especially for the treatment of hemorrhages and the healing of wounds and ulcers, particularly of the genitals. It was also an important ingredient of medicines for the stomach and the digestive system. And I should mention that the cistus, the rock growth on which lives the parasite, was used for the preparation of labdanum, a substance used in perfumery and medicine in antiquity and right up to the 20th century. A very specific type of microamphora must also be interpreted as a container for some kind of medicament. 9 examples are known so far. 4, if not 5 of which were found on Cyprus. One comes from Beirut and the other 2 from the antiquities market. And in fact, looking for more images, I found another one on sale on the web. So there is yet another one on sale on the market. Given the number found in Cyprus, a Cypriot origin is likely for all of them. They are made of lead and bear similar rudimentary decoration, but also the inscription Fiv on one side, Ari on the other, and the name in the Genedit must denote the maker of whatever was contained in this little amphora. This must have been something used in very small quantities, since the containers measure only about 3.5 centimeters, and their holding capacity is absolutely minute. Possible candidates are a perfume, which I think less likely for a lead container, or a collyrium. I opt for a collyrium for 2 main reasons. As we have seen, the ex votos show that eye problems gave Cypriots a lot of trouble. But so far, not a single collyrium has been found on the island. They are common elsewhere. Furthermore, the maker of one of the most famous collyria of antiquity was the Cypriot physician Diagoras, who was a commentator of Hippocrates and worked on ear and eye diseases. He also composed the very famous collyrium known as the Arrodon Digigoru Tomega Calumenon, and you can see the recipe there if you are interested. The properties and ingredients of which collyrium were recorded by Oribasius and repeated by Aetius. It was used for treating severe pains, pustules, burns, corneal diseases, ophthalmias, and many more, all to do with the eye. The last example we will examine is one of those rare cases where both container and content survive. These are bronze cylindrical boxes found in the so-called tomb of the surgeon in Paphos, dated to the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD, which we will examine in a little more detail later on. Unfortunately, the contents of some were lost through perforation caused by rust. Where the cylinders were still sealed, however, they were found to contain small pills and powders. The analysis of these showed that they all contained mineral salts, mostly of copper. And let me remind you that the owner of these containers was buried soon after 166 AD, the year that Galen visited Cyprus in order to collect such minerals from its mines. Also of interest is the fact that the storage of medicaments in metallic containers is recommended by several doctors, such as Scribonius, Marcellus, and Galen. I must mention, however, that the analyses were carried out nearly 40 years ago and were aimed at tracing minerals. New analyses need to be done in order to check for the presence of organic matters. The cylindrical medicine containers were found in the tomb of the surgeon in Paphos, which I was fortunate to excavate back in 1983. Despite the looting and heavy disturbance, the tomb yielded several pottery and glass vessels and objects of stone and bone, as well as 25 identifiable surgical instruments and many fragments made of either bronze or iron or both, the most important of which I will discuss now. I will start with the cylindrical container, the one on the left, similar but slightly longer and more slender than those containing medicaments. It was in fact an etui holding a set of 6 thin instruments, all made of bronze, an ear probe, a probe with 2 olivary ends, a probe with one olivary end, a spoon probe, and possibly two giathiscomyle. One of them is broken and is difficult to identify. Obviously, these instruments were considered too delicate and had to be stored carefully in this container. Excuse me. The importance of hygiene was understood in antiquity, thus all surgical instruments like these of Paphos were made of metal and were without wooden or bone handles so that they could be quickly and thoroughly cleaned. In the case of scalpels, where a thin, sharp cutting edge was necessary, an iron blade, I'm afraid they're mostly broken because iron does not survive well in the soil of Cyprus. So where there was an iron blade that needed a cutting edge, this was added onto the bronze handle so that it could be replaced if it needed, if it broke, but it could also be sharpened as necessary. Here you can see how they fitted and slotted onto the main body, which is bronze on the left, iron on the right. When possible, two instruments, like here with these scalpels, two instruments were combined in one. So here the blade, the other end has a spatulate form and was used for many, many different purposes, including cauterization and as a blunt knife. For reasons of medicine again, very occasionally, some of the instruments, like this double blunt hook, had gilded handles. They also had relief decoration or raised rings in order to afford a better grip and not slip during operation. The double blunt hook that you see is a particularly rare instrument in general that was used for cutting around and lifting blood vessels during operations. Similar, but not quite the same blunt hooks have been found in the so-called Domus der Chirurgo in Rimini, a find that, as we will see, is of the highest importance for Cyprus. Here you see iron shears, which had a general use as scissors, but also for operations in the ventral area and also for the removal of hernias and fleshy growths. And one shudders remembering that all these procedures were carried out without anesthetic. Bone levers are a standard instrument of a Roman surgical instrumentarium. The Parthian surgeon had a set of iron bone levers of different sizes to be used as needed. Here you see two with handles of bronze fitted at each end with the iron levers, which are slotted like the blades of the scalpels and slotted into the bronze handle. And as in the case of the lower example, they were further fixed in position, made more secure with an iron pin. And of course, like the scalpels, the iron ends of bone levers often broke during operation. So this is why they are made in this way, and so that they could be replaced as needed. Another common but always fascinating tool in a surgeon's armory was the bleeding cap. Capping could be dry or wet, and dry capping is still practiced on the island. It is in fact coming back into fashion everywhere, and it's popular now in Hollywood and amongst athletes. It increases blood circulation, relieves muscle tension, and promotes the repair of cells. Of course, modern cups are made of glass. In antiquity, they were mostly of metal, but all sorts of other things were used also in antiquity. Dry cupping releases tension, muscle tension, and promotes repair of cells. But it is also used to treat practically everything. The narrow neck and large body of the Paphos example shows that it could also be used for wet cupping, where excess or bad blood was extracted after scarification of the skin, and with the sanction of the cup, the trapped blood would be, the extracted blood would be trapped in the enlarged body of the cup. You have to imagine this in a horizontal position for catching the blood. At first sight, a stylus, the writing instrument par excellence, might seem out of place amongst surgical instruments. Its use by a doctor, however, is mentioned for the extraction of teeth by Galen and secundines by Hippocrates. Its chisel-like eraser end could also be used as a cautery. I have left for last the most important, because so far unique, instrument of the Paphos instrumentarium. This is a syringe-like bronze object, 20.2 centimeters long, consisting of a hollow tube open at one end. The other end is fitted with a thin tube with a perforation at the tip and perhaps another perforation on the side. At first, I described it as a clister, enema. Its size, however, made me rethink and propose that it is a pulkos, an instrument mentioned by Galen and described by Heron of Alexandria. Indeed, it fits Heron's description, especially as inside the large tube, there is a second tube of bronze with a wooden handle, which was used as a plunger. This identification as a pulkos is now generally accepted, and the Paphos instruments remains a unique example of this special tool described by Heron. The instrument was used for injecting drugs into the ear, the prepuce, fistulas, and things of that sort, and with a reverse motion of the plunger for cleaning wounds and absorbing fluids, and above all, as its name implies, for removing pus from wounds and ulcers. This stone palette is also from the tomb of the surgeon. Such objects are usually associated with the preparation of cosmetics and are often found in graves of women. In the hands of a surgeon, however, the plaquette was used for the preparation of medicinal powders and ointments, as well as for sharpening blades. I don't know if you can see it, but there are very strong marks on the edge of the palette, which was clearly used for sharpening the blades used by the doctor. A similar object, also of certain medical use, brings us to a recent discovery made by the mission of the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, excavating in the Agora of Paphos. And I express my gratitude to Professor Evdoxia Papuchi-Vladika for providing me with this and the next photograph. As we have seen in the tomb of the surgeon, delicate instruments were kept in a tubular etui. Here we have a rectangular cassette, the other standard way of storing and carrying surgical instruments. The wooden box has perished, but the hinged bronze lid survives. Sorry, that's the hinge lid. The instruments contained in the cassette are generally similar to the ones from the surgeon's tomb, but on the whole, lighter and simpler. As well as the palette, the set includes a bone lever, a spatula, an ear probe, a hook, and a pair of tweezers, all made of bronze, and a small lever made of iron. The excavators date these instruments to the first quarter of the 2nd century AD. Thus, they would antedate those of the surgeon in the tomb by about 50 years. How all these instruments were used is known from the accounts of ancient doctors and writers in general. By contrast, there is absolutely no information on another very important group of finds. These two come from Paphos, and for those that are not familiar with ancient Cyprus, I should explain that the reason that Paphos has yielded so many finds is because the city was the Hellenistic and Roman capital of the island. Furthermore, Salamis, the second most important Cypriot city in antiquity, is found in the part of the island occupied by foreign forces since 1974 and is not being systematically excavated. The objects I'm talking about, you see here, are clay vessels in the shape of different parts of the human body. The vessels have very thin walls, barely 3 millimeters thick, and must have been a kind of hot water bottle that acted like the emplastra, the plasters, and the thermasmata mentioned by Hippocrates and Galen. Filled with a warm liquid, we assume, of course, they were applied to the aching part of the body in order to cause hyperemia and relieve pain. As you can see, these vessels not only look like the part of the body they are meant to treat, but their underside is molded so as to fit tightly onto that particular part. There are vessels for almost every part of the body in pairs, including left and right limbs. There is even a vessel for the thorax and one for male genitals. This particular find comprised 17 more or less complete vessels and many fragments, which were considered unique. Now, the excavations I have been conducting at the House of Orpheus, always in Paphos, have added a new set of these. They have not been restored yet, but you can see them. Some of these examples are much finer in quality of clay and show much more detail, like the hair around the ear, than the previous collection. They also include some completely new forms. The top one here, I assume, is for a woman's breast. It's the only thing that would fit the size of this object. And furthermore, there is nothing particularly feminine or made for a woman in the whole collection. We have male genitals, but nothing for the female equivalent. So a breast is a likely candidate. The one at the bottom is even more unusual because it is used in a completely different way from the rest. Instead of being applied onto the body, it is the sole of the foot, the right foot here, that would sit on the hot water bottle laid on the floor in order to relieve pain or relax, or the equivalent of a hot foot bath, I imagine. Such hot water bottles with realistic anatomical detail are unknown elsewhere on the island. In fact, the Paphos vessels were considered unique in the ancient world, save for one example found in the sea off the coast of the island of Chios in Greece. Recently, however, a hot water bottle for the right foot was discovered in the Domus del Chirurgo in Paphos. Domus del Chirurgo in Rimini in Italy. The house, destroyed by fire around the middle of the 3rd century AD, gave an incredible collection of objects associated with the surgeon, many glass and pottery vessels, and an incredible number of 150 recognizable surgical instruments, several of which are similar to those of Paphos. I have already mentioned that the rare double blunt hook of Paphos finds parallels in this collection here. And of course, here you see some more of this incredible collection. And of course, the hot water bottle of Rimini and that of Paphos for the right foot are practically identical. And there is certainly an undeniable relation between the two collections. The Rimini surgeon appears to have been a sophisticated Grecophone who came from the Greek East. His name was Ephtihis, if the one surviving inscription is to be trusted. So he came from the East and originated from the same high scientific environment to which the Paphos surgeon also belonged. At the same time, the similarities that exist between the two groups of tools show that surgery in Paphos was in line with practices in the wider Roman world and closer to the capital. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Michaelides. I think Maria would like me to continue directly on. I too would like to extend my thanks to His Excellency, Mr. Kokoudis, the High Commissioner of Cyprus in the UK, for his introduction, his very kind words. I would also like to thank Maria and George for their invitation to respond to this paper. I've enjoyed listening to it very much, and of course to Professor Michaelides himself. Thank you for a fascinating, if all too brief, journey through some of the archaeological material from Cyprus. I am not an archaeologist, and I'm someone who's slightly more familiar with the literary evidence for ancient medicine than the archaeological. And I'm also someone who's ultimately more interested in the history of the body as a cultural historian than medicine specifically. So some of the comments I make below stem from an interest in the material as it was presented today, as well as trying to connect some of those materials with the issues raised and questions raised for my own area of focus. I will speak relatively briefly. I will just pick out a number of what I think are the most telling examples of the material, and that's by no means meant to suggest that that's all I found fascinating about this paper. One area I was particularly fascinated by was the discussion of medical instrumentaria and the storage vessels from the tomb of the surgeon in Paphos. In the first instance, the range of items is remarkable, but it seems also to speak to the intersection between trauma and surgery on the one hand, and more hygienic elements of medicine, the medicinal, the pharmaceutical on the other. And I was fascinated to think of texts like Galen's on the medical art, which are roughly contemporary with the late 2nd century AD doctor, who was buried in the tomb at Paphos, talking about the division of the medical art into a range of different specializations, from one end, very specific forms of surgery, right through to those people who would be focused more on drug law and pharmaceutical practice. So it was interesting to see these two combined in this medical environment. This was perhaps also brought home by the comparison with the House of the Surgeon in Italy, in Rimini, where we've also discovered a combination of significantly finely crafted surgical tools, the more delicate thermosmata, and I think as well some medicinal items. A second aspect that particularly struck me was the quality of these items and the care taken to preserve them. I was put in mind especially of the Galenic treatise recently discovered, entitled Avoiding Distress. The main thrust of this treatise, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the Great Fire in Rome in 192 AD destroyed a number of storehouses in which Galen, the doctor who was working in Rome at the time, lost a considerable amount of literary material, his books, his commentaries, but also a number of other artifacts. Galen's point, of course, is that despite this remarkable loss, he was able to avoid any form of grief. His treatise is no doubt rhetorical. We can look askance at the claim that an elite figure from the late 2nd century AD wasn't really concerned with the loss of so much gold, but was rather more concerned with the loss of his books. But what does interest me here, or what is relevant to this discussion, are the way he treats medical artifacts and some medical texts. Among the losses he discusses are his drug recipe books. Early in the treatise, Galen describes a rich man from Pergamum, a colleague of his, who wanted to buy recipes for over 100 gold pieces. The recipes cost over 100 gold pieces, and that he succeeded in buying those that were highly regarded by all modern doctors in Asia. Another friend of Galen's, who had collected together recipes in one place from all the world during his travels. Galen's describing here how he came to be in possession of a rather remarkable collection of drug recipes. He goes on to make the point that when he wished to acquire a particularly coveted drug or medicament, he was able, on the basis of consulting these recipe books, to barter with a particular trader or a particular doctor by exchanging similar substances for the ones he really wanted. The second aspect that's relevant from this treatise concerns the more material losses from his storerooms in Rome. Galen was concerned less with the loss of gold and silver plate and more with the huge quantity of drugs, simple and compound, and the instruments that were destroyed in the fire. He goes on to lament rather shrilly his losses in the following terms. Some of these instruments were valuable for medical practice, he tells us, and he hoped to replace them relatively easily. Others were more difficult. He had invented them himself by making models out of wax and giving them then to a smith to construct. And the reason I've kind of pointed to these two things, the first one is to flag up this fascinating trade in pharmaceuticals. And Professor Michaelides has already talked at length about the refined substances that were perhaps used in very small amounts and were stored in the micro containers, the Caleria. But we know that Cyprus was involved in a kind of almost global trade in medicaments, in minerals, in other substances that went into a remarkable amount of drugs. And so I just wanted to sort of think about that from the other perspective in terms of doctors thinking about how valuable these substances were and what lengths they had to go to acquire them. And you might have recalled from that papyrus example just how rare and just how exotic some of the ingredients of these drugs were. The second reason for mentioning this, of course, is to talk about these instruments and to highlight or to underscore the effort and the time that went into making them. Galen would construct these instruments in wax. He would then give them to a smith who would surround them in clay, heat the mold, melt the wax, and then you have a mold to create a particular instrument. But they really are fine artifacts, highly valued by doctors, as we've seen in the case of the tomb at Paphos. Galen's passage, as I've said, is surely rhetorical, but it does underscore the individual interest. Sorry. The individual interest of doctors in constructing specific instruments required by their activity. I'm put in mind, of course, of the famous medical contexts, perhaps held, or certainly held in the festival in honor of Asclepius at Ephesus, a contemporary with both Galen and this doctor at Paphos, which tested doctors in their prowess for recipes, surgery, instrumentation, or the invention of instruments, and other elements of their practice. So we have sort of three or four examples: Galen, the tomb of the surgeon from Paphos, the house of the surgeon from Rimini, and of course the medical contest at Ephesus, which seem to suggest a real ability of doctors not only to construct instruments, but to branch across different aspects of medicine that we might ordinarily think are not necessarily connected. So that's the first major element I wanted to talk about that I found particularly fascinating. And I think there are bigger questions also to be raised about the particular context of the late 2nd century AD, the role some of these doctors might have had in military activity, particularly given their apparent focus on trauma surgery, or their professional expertise in dealing with major surgery. That perhaps is an issue more specifically related to the house in Rimini, but I suspect it might also impact on our understanding of things going on in Cyprus as well. The second major aspect that interested me in particular was the discussion of ex voto offerings of different kinds throughout Professor Michaelides' presentation, especially these kind of ancient hot water bottles that were found in Paphos. As an aficionado of the hot water bottle in the UK, I was particularly keen to see these, and as a young man, I was particularly exposed to having lots of different kinds of hot water bottles or cold packs that would go on different parts of the body, depending on which one had been hit by a cricket ball. These were particularly fascinating for me from a personal perspective, but they also speak to me in a professional sense as well. They speak, to my mind, of a kind of fascination with specific bodily parts. And I wanted to think about them just in terms of the fragmentation of the body and the focus throughout ancient medicine on locations within the body, or breaking up the body into separate limbs, into separate joints, into separate parts. Okay, so they speak more broadly, I think, to a theme of bodily fragmentation, which has kind of been a leitmotif of certainly recent discussions of votive offerings and ancient medicine more generally. And we're quite practiced as a scholarly community in thinking about the issue of fragmentation in relation to the models of body parts left as votive offerings in Asclepius and other locations around the Mediterranean. And I thought there were some really lovely examples in your talk in terms of models of particular body parts. But I thought it was really interesting to see the candles that were left by more recent dedicants who would agree to leave an equivalent amount of wax or something like that for a particular cure. There's a real sense that the body is being, or something is being left in place of the body in some of these votive offerings. And I just thought that was really fascinating, from not only from the perspective of the continuity of practice from ancient to modern, but also in terms of what that continuity of practice is kind of emphasizing about how you leave the body in a particular location. The first thing I wanted to mention in this, one of the major themes in scholarly discussion of fragmentation is that illness itself is experienced as a kind of fragmentation. It's significant, for instance, that we note that non-functioning parts of the body, we assume they're non-functioning parts in most instances, can be separated out from the whole of the body. We can divide, the arm or the ear that's not, the eye that's not working, and we can, leave a model of it in a particular place. At a certain level, this suggests that the body can be conceptualized as a collection of parts, organs, limbs, etc. some of which work effectively. And in the case of votive offerings, could you just excuse me for 1 minute? Could you just go away? 2 minutes. In the case, my apologies, some of which work effectively, and in the case of votive offerings, some that is functional, injured, or perceived as not being proper in some way. There are, I think, some really interesting questions raised here about the relationship between the approach to the body and notions both of identity and its dependence on a whole body. This is perhaps exacerbated by medical approaches which emphasize individual parts of the body. Galen, for instance, and his predecessor Archaeological of Apamea, two very famous, one very famous and one less well-known doctor from the 2nd century AD, both wrote treatises on thinking about the affected parts of the body. Diagnosing specific locations and their functions within the body. But this kind of focus on parts is fairly familiar from lots of writers, contemporary medical writers. We're also aware that even though diagnosing parts of the body was really important, that health and beauty and selfhood were often defined in terms of symmetry, the balance between all of the functioning parts of the body. The mixture, what Galen would call the balance or the symmetria of the body as a whole. So I'd be very interested to think about this in terms of what it means to break up the body into different parts, what it means for thinking about health, what it means for thinking about the individual and their body. Okay. The second issue which has been raised concerning votive offerings concerns the ways in which such artifacts connect the ill individual, their body, and the location in which the votives are offered. And this is really going back to what I was saying about the wax and about the models of the body being left in a specific location. One is left to wonder, and when I say one is left to wonder, what I mean is I realize this might be an unanswerable question, to what extent the dedicants identify with the artifact that is left. Is this a body part they go back to revisit? Is this a body part that's meant to represent a rejected former part of their body that was not working but now is functioning properly? Is it meant to mark a distinction between the individual's past, the ill body, the non-functioning body that I've left in that location in the Asclepion or the other sanctuaries, and a future, the healthy, whole, functioning body of the individual post-healing event, after the healing event? Or do they perform a slightly more connective role in terms of linking the individual with that specific space? A part of me is always linked to that location where I left that model of my body, might be one of the things these artifacts are trying to say. As I said, I'm not trying to put any pressure on producing an answer to some of these questions. They are more speculations than anything else, but I'm trying to get at some of these, what these artifacts mean for the experience of illness, and what one does or how one reacts to the act of depositing them. The final point I really wanted to raise was to return to these thermosmata, which are slightly different. They raise similar questions to the votive offerings, but they're slightly different as well. The point about the way in which the body is replicated in the votive offerings leads me to consider these kind of anatomical structures in more detail. We see here again the focus on specific parts of the body. There's a replication here, a model being fabricated of certain parts of the body. And of course, we can link it with, again, this culture of thinking about diagnosing certain parts of the body, about locating illness in certain parts of the body, or just treating certain parts of the body. Yet while we're thinking about it being a very part-based focus, or very focused on very specific parts of the body, I thought your slide number 39, where you have the model of the bodies and you put all of these little thermosmata together, really emphasized just how much there's a kind of technological reproduction of a whole body. Oh, thank you for bringing it up. Yes, that's lovely. This is exactly the one I meant, yes. So that really brought home to me how this fabrication, or how these little anatomically defined structures or anatomically accurate structures are really creating a kind of a whole body, when you put them together, you can kind of imagine the doctor's shelf in his surgery. So yeah, again, here there's this kind of relationship between the part and the whole. At the same time, and this is again where I become a little bit more speculative, and I do apologize for that. I'm not normally quite so speculative. There are some really interesting issues raised about the way the body is approached in terms of how these artifacts are made. Professor Michaelides confirmed for me before that some of them have quite significant anatomical detail. We saw, if we looked at some of them in close detail, you could see the hair around the ear, but also on some of the others as well, there was quite clearly some attempt to really replicate anatomical structures. Okay, so these artifacts offer a kind of tracing of the human body, both of its parts and of the whole. But what kind of tracing is it? Who was the model for some of these anatomically constructed elements? On the one hand, it creates a permanent form of that body. You know, the person who modeled that ear that we're being shown on the screen at the moment, or the left hand perhaps, is permanently preserved. But what happens to the patient who doesn't quite fit that model? Yeah, okay, we might have ones of different size, but you know, there might be a situation in which an individual needs not only a left hand of a particular size, but a right hand of a slightly different size. And this raises quite interesting questions about how we think about the body and its technological treatment. Okay, the other point I thought was particularly interesting here was that on the one hand, there are elements that produce a specific historical body, that speak to a specific historical individual's body that has been preserved. But it's also a kind of generic body. You know, here's a model being constructed that's meant to stand in for or work on a majority of bodies. It's a kind of everybody. Okay, so we're kind of oscillating between a very specific model that might have been, you know, literally crafted against someone's body, but also a kind of generic model that this is what a thigh is meant to look like. This is it's meant to be its kind of broad shape, and so on. So there's interesting questions about individuation and generic views of the body in these artifacts. Those last few lines of mine were, as I said, particularly speculative, partly because I know very little about these thermosmata. But I would like to just close by emphasizing how much I enjoyed this talk. And as I said at the beginning, I thought it was just all too brief. I would quite happily engage in my own research on this from now on. But thank you very much, Professor Michaelides.
Well, I respond now?
Yeah, before we open the floor to questions and answers, yeah, Professor, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. King, for your comments, and above all for talking about the fragmentation of the body. Obviously, in 30 minutes that I was given, and I went over the 30 minutes, I'm aware of that, there was no time to discuss the fragmentation of the body and the new discussions relating to that. But obviously, this is a very valid point. And I should mention that apart from the obvious anatomical what do you call them, hot water bottles, as you can see, and there are more, there are also hot water bottles for joints, which is not really a separate part of the body. We have for the elbow and, for the shoulder and for the elbow. Here, the one you see here is actually for the elbow, but it's been placed in front. So this I find particularly interesting because it is not a separate part of the body, it's a joint. So obviously they had to take care of every ailing part of the human body. clearly, we don't have enough examples to be able to arrive at certain conclusions. But from the other fragments found with this collection, we know that there are different sizes, especially for the legs, clearly intended for different individuals. Were they men of different heights, or were some for women and some for men? We don't know, but we certainly have a variety. They are too fragmentary to show, but they are clearly of different sizes. And I think that, like in the case of the bone livers, that we know from the written sources that surgeons were advised to have many different sizes to use as needed, whoever was using these hot water bottles must have had a rich collection of them. Unfortunately, this find was a casual discovery made a long time ago, and only the foundation pit of a building was excavated, of a modern building. They were building something in the archaeological zone, and these things came up. The excavation did not go beyond this rectangular pit. But what was found in the pit, and it relates to what you said about having things on a shelf, these hot water bottles were found in rows, and they clearly fell there from a wooden shelf. So again, we can imagine whoever was using them, or perhaps making them, we don't know what the site was used for, had a whole variety of them to be used as needed. You raise a question about leaving an ex voto and having the memory of your vote, of your prayer left there. In antiquity, of course, it was different. In modern times, in Cyprus, because it's wax, the wax is melted and made into candles. What I don't know, and I need to look into, is what happens if somebody makes an ex voto but is not healed. Does he go back and remove it, or does he leave it there? This is something I need to look into. Let me see what else I noted here. Yeah, you mentioned about military doctors. Of course, Cyprus is not very military in this time of its history, but what we do have, and that's more evident in the ex votos, which I didn't show, is limbs with missing fingers or toes. And this is clearly the result of an agricultural society. These are the first things that get wounded. Manual labor and agriculture, these are the things that are most exposed, toes and fingers. And we do have ex votos with hands with missing fingers. So this must be related to what we have in military hospitals, but for another reason here. The tomb of the doctor, as I said, contained 27 recognizable instruments and many fragments, which unfortunately, as the tomb was looted, they were smashed to pieces and we cannot put them together. But, and we don't know if his practice during his life had more instruments that were not buried with him. But it is certainly a rich collection, a very rich collection of somebody who had a clinic, let's say. By contrast to the new find from the Polish excavations in the Agora, where the instruments are smaller and they all fit in a small rectangular box, I think that is more a case of a doctor dealing with emergency cases, you know, going to look at somebody is like a traveling kit of a doctor, because it's missing all the other important things. You cannot conceive of an instrumentarium without a bleeding cup, for example. They're almost everywhere, but not in that collection. So we have two different types of doctors, I think. One heavy duty, the other lighter duty. So what else did I note here? Yes, about the quality of manufacture of the instruments. They are absolutely beautiful. They're so wonderfully made. And you can see that a lot of thought has gone behind them. Of course, we know from written sources there is advice on how to make instruments. Make sure they're not too heavy, make sure they're not too light, make sure they balance properly. But to actually see the finished objects, they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. And I showed one, the bone liver, which had gold plating on it. I am sure others in Paphos were covered in gold, but the soil of Cyprus is merciless to metal, even gold. There is one more instrument which preserves a lot of gold, which I did not show. It is a cannula. It is a long tube, tapering tube, well, about this big, which was used for removing fluid trapped in different parts of the body. They just pierce the body and the fluid would come out. And that's covered in gold. And this reminds me, and this is like you had a personal reminiscence. I have my own personal reminiscence. When I excavated the tomb of the surgeon, my father, who was a doctor, trained in the 20s of last century, when he saw the instruments, he identified every single one of them, while it took me a lot of searching in literature to find out what they were. But they were familiar to him in the sense that some of these things went on being used till modern times, especially the cannula. The cannula, I could not understand what it was. And he said, oh, well, very simple. And he explained. And last, yes, Galen, just to add to what you said, he had great loss with the fire of Rome, but he left us an amazing number of writings. Too many to read. I mean, there's endless writings by Galen, all very useful and very interesting. I think the only other thing I didn't mention is that in the Cypriot ex votos, we don't have a single internal organ. Internal organs are rare because, of course, dissection and all that in antiquity, but they do exist, especially the uterus for women. But we have none in Cyprus in antiquity, although in modern times, of course, we have livers, kidneys, hearts, we have everything in wax. So I think I responded. Thank you very much, anyway, for all you said.
Thank you so much. As I already wrote on the chat box, you can, I'm sure there are plenty of questions. You can either type it and we can read it for you, or you can just raise your hand and you can ask it yourself. So we've already got one, Professor. Amanda Murphy is asking, has there been any analysis of the metal used to make the Paphos instruments?
No, it has not. And that's something that needs to be done together with a further analysis of the contents. One of them had some strange strange looking bits of metal at the joints, and I had it analyzed, but the results were too vague and well, they didn't really give an answer. We need to do it again.
Okay.
But bronze, of course, bronze predominates, but of course, bronze is not always the same. We have to analyze it.
Okay. Next question.
Ask something.
Maria, please do.
Thank you, Demetres.
Thank you, Maria.
Very exciting. I mean, these two, let's call them bags, containers with the surgeon instruments. We have two different kind of physician, or just two different kind of bags, because we have a text, the so-called the decorum, the Hippocratic text. Probably you're aware of that. I don't know. Which and this just describes these two kind of bags. The first bag, we don't get a name for the first bag, but it's a bag containing mechane, organa, and if I remember, sideros, if I remember correctly. And then we have another bag that is called parexodos helitotere, which in this bag contains armena, and armena are small and lighter instruments. Usually they are phlebotoma, instruments to open veins, or they are, he talks about ergalia, in any case, lighter and simple instruments. And this bag is used in cases where the doctor, the physician must travel, it's apodemia, it's according to the text. Yes, it's just a common for these two different type of containers.
Well, I should say in relation to this that the tubular etuis are not represented in ancient art, or if they are represented, you don't know if they were for medicine or for delicate instruments. But the rectangular box that was found by my colleagues from Poland is often represented, especially on tombstones of doctors, open, showing its context. So that's more characteristic of a doctor than the long tubular boxes, which were more for medicaments.
Yes, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so next question, Professor, it seems that we focus too much on the body. So Eleni Palazidou is asking, is there any evidence or artifacts or scripts in ancient Cyprus referring to mental illnesses?
Not the Cypriot ones, but there are references, of course, to what we call nowadays mental illnesses, yes, but not with a Cypriot origin.
Mm-hmm. Another question, are there any human skeletons with evidence of medical practice, for instance, amputations or?
Yes, there are. Of course, people had not been looking for them in the past, so we lost a lot of evidence. But we have, for example, something that has been studied, we have deformation of the skull made on purpose, presumably for cosmetic reasons. But that is an aspect that has been studied. And what we have more evidence for, because people have been looking for it, of course, are diseases which leave their mark on the body, not only from wounds, but actual diseases like the cripra orbitalia, the porous orbit of the eye socket, which is the result of thalassemia, which is one of the problems Cyprus always had. Also, the many skulls with hyperostosis, where again it's caused by or some form of anemia. Most people believe it's thalassemia. Amputations, I cannot think of one now, but I'm sure they must have been found, but I cannot think of one. There is no evidence of trepanation. There are rumors that there were skulls with trepanation, but I have not managed to locate them yet.
Okay, we've got another one. So from Elizabeth Hess. So the lead microamphorae appeared very similar in size and design to the lead ampullae used as medieval pilgrim badges. Another interesting continuity from ancient times, or could there be any other similarities in use or manufacture?
Absolutely right about the similarity and the size. Well, the medieval ampullae are a bit larger. These are absolutely tiny. You can hardly handle them between your fingers. But certainly, and the use of lead, I think, is significant for a liquid, because lead has a negative aura in antiquity, but not always, as in this case here, and as in the Middle Ages. Of course, we are not 100% sure that they did contain a collyrium, as I said, or a perfume. But the fact that the name Fivariu is in the genitive, a genitive of an object is usually, in our cases, is usually the name of the person that made whatever is contained in it. Unfortunately, Fivarion or Fivarios is practically unknown in antiquity. There is a Latin version of the name, but as I believe, not a single instance of this name has been made outside this tiny little amphora. They were made in two halves, like the ampulle, in molds, and then soldered together with heat. And they must have used a similar mold or made molds from one to the other, because their decoration is practically identical. So is the inscription and the way it is split on two sides of the vessel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe, to go back to the original question, whatever they contained was neither a collyrium, not a perfume, but something else they collected from a sanctuary of some, like the ampulle of the Middle Ages. But we don't know, so the issue remains open.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a very brief question myself? You said at some point, you stressed that many of these instruments are beautifully made. And I wonder if you see, as an archaeologist, if you see an artistic side in them, because that would be tremendously interesting, in the sense that we tend to conceive of medical instruments today only as functional things. Whereas if we, I mean, are you willing to suggest that some of these objects that we're seeing, they're not just instrumental, but there's something beautiful in them, which would mean, it would seem to suggest that they're mediating, let's say, what is otherwise a very painful and excruciating experience. They're mediating it in a context which raises a certain artistic awareness. And this is really, really weird, I find.
Yes, I think you are right. But also, I think the fact that a surgeon had a beautiful instrument, and they are beautiful, like this. I mean, the photograph doesn't do it right. It's absolutely beautiful, this object. It's like going to a doctor today who has the latest in medical instruments, you know, or equipment. The same thing must have happened in antiquity. A good instrument, an expensive instrument, implied a good doctor.
Okay, that's very interesting.
But you see all the rings and the gilding on this one. it's again what is prescribed by ancient authors to be very carefully made so that they don't slip, because this is a double blunt hook. They had to lift blood vessels with it. So the hand had to be absolutely firm, holding the middle of the instrument and not slip. So not only it's beautiful, but it's extremely functional.
Okay. So we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. If anyone wants to ask something. Someone is asking. The lecture is recorded and it's going to be uploaded in our website. So we'll keep you updated. Absolutely.
Maybe another lecture will talk about the plants and minerals, but
exactly.
There was no time this time.
Elizabeth, she's saying that her son-in-law, who's an orthopedic surgeon, he feels that an artificial hip joint is so beautiful that it's on display. So yeah, absolutely. And Professor, since we don't have another question, I'm going to abuse my organizing thing, and I'm going to ask another one. What about the absence of anesthetics? I mean, looking at all these instruments, the first thing that comes to mind is the pain they're inflicting.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, from what I know, we don't have many descriptions of patients saying we don't get to hear their voice as to how they feel when they go to the doctor.
We don't hear it because they took it for granted that they would suffer.
Okay.
I can't remember the doctor, but there is one doctor of antiquity who talks to a younger doctor and says, I don't care how good a doctor you are. What I do care about is that you are able to bear the screaming and shouting of your patients when you are operating, which I think shows you what was happening, because there was no anesthetic, of course, opium and wine or whatever, but it's not enough.
But Dan, who wrote a book on experiencing pain, he raised his hand. So please, Dan, sorry.
I was just going to say, there are lots of examples where doctors talk about threatening patients with treatment and the patient scarpering, and this being a test of whether or not they were truly desirous of the surgery. And other examples of doctors being lauded for their ability to encourage the patient during their painful remedies. They were quite aware of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just thought I'd.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So two last. Yes, sorry, Professor.
Do we have a record of a patient recording his painful experience?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We got enough questions to go with, and this should be, I guess, the last ones. So Stella Dinenis, she's asking, she's very partial to water bottles. How hot could they be, and could they cause burns?
That I don't know. And we don't know what they were filled with. Obviously, it must have been something warm, like hot water bottles today. It's been suggested that they use olive oil, which retains its heat for longer than water. But unfortunately, all the hot water bottles that we know of, the ones in Cyprus at least, have been found in very small fragments, and they have not been analyzed before they were reconstructed in the shape you see them today. So we don't know if there were traces inside them of whatever they contained. I assume that they tried not to burn the patient, but certainly they would apply it as warm as possible, because the warmer the better, like with a hot water bottle. I see a raised hand.
Yeah, may I?
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm not the one who says yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, please go on, and there are a few
Thank
questions
you.
more, but yes, please do.
Absolutely fascinating lecture. Thank you very much. I kind of cringed a bit when I saw these instruments for abdominal operations. And I wonder, do we have any information on how many people actually survived this kind of surgery? Some must have done, otherwise they wouldn't continue. But I just wonder whether there's any record of success.
There is, but I don't have it fresh in my head. But obviously, a lot of people died. Even nowadays, people die in operations. So just imagine in antiquity what happened.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Eleni Palazidou, she's asking. She wasn't satisfied by your reply before, Professor, and she's asking whether we do have any evidence on mania or melancholia. Eleni, I don't think we do. We have quite a lot in the Hippocratic corpus already, but nothing to connect it specifically with Cyprus, I would say. But if you want to ask it yourself, please unmute your microphone and. Yeah.
I'm really sorry to insist and to pester you on this. I've been trying to find evidence and I haven't got very far. We know that medicine was advanced in Cyprus in ancient times, and that there were Hippocratic schools, and Hippocrates wrote a lot about mental disorders like mania and depression, which he's the first one to describe. Or delirium, people in a delirious state. So I'm surprised that there isn't anything at all in Cyprus, in these Hippocratic schools. Do we have any writings that survived as to what they were doing, what they were teaching?
Not specific to Cyprus, we don't. There is one book, I forget the author, it's a doctor, an active doctor, Itrella στην Kipro, Madness in Cyprus. Okay. And he goes through the ages, but I don't think, I need to check, I don't think there is any reference to antiquity.
Thank you. Yeah, I won't take it any further, thank you.
Okay. If I find something, I'll let you know.
Please, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Do you know this book about madness?
I heard of it a while ago and I forgot about it, but I'll look it out. Thank you. Do you know the name of the person?
Hadjidimitriou.
Hadjidimitriou. Thank you.
So next question. These instruments, do they come from Greek mainland, or some of the ancient doctors use similar or the same instruments? So yeah.
A very good question and unanswerable. Good makers of good instruments were sought after. Of course, good doctors made their own instruments, and we know that. But when you see the similarities that exist between instruments in the Mediterranean, at least, from Italy east, you realize that there must have been common models, if nothing else. They were not necessarily made in Greece, anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean or Asia Minor in particular, where we do have wonderful collections, are also likely places. But also instruments traveled. Obviously, it's not an instrument, but the hot water bottle in Rimini is just one hot water bottle, while in Cyprus we have so many. Obviously, it was not made there. It traveled there from somewhere else, presumably the East Mediterranean or Cyprus, we don't know. So I cannot answer your question. We don't know, but they were, as I said, good instruments were sought after because, of course, they're vital to the profession and for the survival of the patient.
And I think that should be it, Maria. Right? It's well. Yeah, it's 7:40. So at this point, I think we should thank everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Demetres.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction. And the comments. Sorry, thank you for the comments.
Okay, we'll meet again in about 3 weeks to learn more about metallic medicine by Dr. Laskaris. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Deus me leva, pais.
Bine, uite, αμέσως. Με πατάς έντο, θέλεις να φύγει.
Συγγνώμη.